think you might have to, do you have to do something as well with that?
Yeah, I have to say got it, not leave the meeting. So I'm still here. Is that okay then? So we are up to 2 Samuel chapter 18 today, and we're going to do the whole of that chapter, and we're going to just veer into chapter 19 as well, because it kind of makes sense with the story. So we have seen how David escaped, had to leave Jerusalem when his third son Absalom was proclaimed king in David's place. But remember all through this that David was still God's anointed king, even though Absalom had sort of come along with all the people. So Absalom and the Israelites who were supporting him went after David and set up camp for the night in Gilead. We saw that last week. David and those who were loyal to him had fled to Mahanaim, which was a little bit further north. And we saw at the end of chapter 17 last week how some of the people loyal to David and some of the people in that town brought bedding and food and to David and his his army, really, so that he could be refreshed and ready for what was going to happen. So that was the end of chapter 17. So chapter 18, can somebody read verses 1 to 8, and you'll need to unmute to do that. Have a volunteer? The first 8 verses.
I will, if you like.
Thanks, Julie.
David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. The king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword.
Okay, then, so we here see how David is, and his followers, of which there are several thousand, are planning their strategy to get David back to Jerusalem, basically, because that's where he was king, that's where he should have been. So what is the first thing that that David does with the troops?
He mustered them.
Right, okay, Marina, what does that mean? Tell us a bit more.
He gathered them together, basically. He brought them to, in order.
Okay, and how did he divide them up?
Commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds.
Okay, yeah, he split them into 3 groups, didn't he? And he had 3 leaders. Who were the 3 leaders? Perhaps I shouldn't ask so many questions. You're all muted, aren't you? Jackie?
Yeah. Abishai, Zeruiah, and Ittai.
Okay, so I think the first one was Joab, wasn't it? So Joab we've met before. He was the loyal army commander. Abishai was Joab's brother, and Ittai the Gittite was actually a Philistine. So we presume that he was one who had been loyal to David when David was actually with the Philistines when he was against Saul all those years ago. So interesting, those are the people that he chose to lead the troops. Okay, so in verses 2 to 4, the king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. And how was that different from what had happened once before?
When David committed adultery with Bathsheba, he'd stayed behind when the troops went out to war.
Okay, so that's what it would have reminded him, wasn't it? On this occasion, David's, I'm going to go with you, I'm going to go with you, because he remembers what happened when he hadn't been with his troops those years ago now. So what did the men actually say to David on this occasion?
No, don't come with us.
Absolutely, don't come with us, because if you were caught, you the king was dead, then that would be the end of all the battles. So David was quite would have been a valuable prize, put it that way, if he'd been captured. So in verse 4, the king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. How would you describe his attitude there?
I thought he was very humble. He listened to what his men said, these hundreds and thousands of men, and he listened to them and said, yeah, okay, maybe you're right and I'm wrong.
Yeah, so that's certainly one of the possibilities. He was humble. I mean, there is another possibility that he could actually been quite depressed at this point, but I'll leave that, as the story goes on, to make up your own mind, really. Okay, so verse 5, what instruction does David give concerning Absalom?
Told him to be gentle with him.
They were to be gentle with Absalom. Absalom was David's third son, but he had, he seems to be quite an ungodly man. He had gone off and tried to get people on his side to make him king. And if you remember, he also was said to be very handsome, and he had this great locks of hair and things. And the people were taken in by him, and they went to Absalom. So that was David's son. Now, this order that David gave, that they had to be gentle concerning Absalom, who heard that order?
All the troops.
All the troops. So it wasn't just given to the 3 commanders. Everyone knew that they had to be, Absalom was still David's son. They had to treat him gently, it says. All right. So we move down to this battle that commences, and basically what happened to David's army. Down in verses 6 and to 8, really.
They had a great victory.
They did. David's army had a great victory. So consequently, what happened to Absalom's army?
They were defeated.
They were indeed, yeah. And it was a horrible big battle. It spread out in the forest, not easy to fight in a forest because you can't see the enemy. And it says the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. So obviously, fighting in the forest wasn't easy. So maybe they got lost, maybe anything could have happened to them, couldn't it? So there was a great, a carnage that day, wasn't there? Lots of men lost their lives. So we go on now then to verses 9 to 15, see what happened next. Somebody read, please. Jackie, thanks.
Oh.
9 to 15.
Okay.
Okay, to 16, did you say?
9 to 15, yeah.
15, okay. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. When one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, "I have just seen Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab said to the man who had told him this, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out in my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from you, the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I am not going to wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him and killed him.
Okay, so quite a story there. I wonder if it's ironic, really, that Absalom's hair got caught in the tree, because that was his crowning glory, wasn't it? That was his pride. He was this wonderful, good-looking man's hair, and actually, what he had been so proud of actually brought about his death, because he got caught. His hair got caught in the tree. It's a bit comical, really, isn't it? I mean, the mule goes on, and he's just left there. So one of the men then sees what's happened. Oh my goodness, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. What does Joab say? Well, he says, "What, you saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there?" Well, the reason he didn't strike him to the ground right there was because he'd heard David's instructions that they weren't to do anything with Absalom, and he respected what the king wanted. But Joab, who has been loyal to David over many years, seems to take a slightly different view. I suppose his idea is that he wants his victory, to be complete. He wants Absalom got rid of, and that kind of takes precedence in his thinking. So he says to this man, why didn't you strike him to the ground? And there's this thing about, I would have given you all this money, if you'd done it. And the man says, even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out in my hand, I would not lay my hand on the king's son. And he says this thing, even if I had put my life in jeopardy and nothing's hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. So therefore, what he's saying is, if I'd gone out and killed the son, killed Absalom, and then David would have heard that, then when this man's life was in jeopardy because he killed the king's son, would Joab have stood up for him? No, not a chance. David would have Joab would have let him go. So this man, not only is he loyal to what David has said, he's also actually how do you describe it? Actually got quite a lot of wisdom there, hasn't he? And common sense, and realizing down the line what might happen if he had gone ahead with that. Okay.
It's quite
So
interesting.
Go on, Anne, yes.
I was just thinking it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because when we looked at the beginning of 2 Samuel, didn't Joab go off and kill Abner when David had expressly said he wasn't to be killed? So he's got a bit of a history, hasn't he?
Joab does seem to be someone who likes to take the law into his own hands. He was actually David's nephew, so he's part of the family, but he does, So how does history judge Joab, or how does God judge Joab? I don't know. He seems to be a very good army commander. He's very strategic and thinks things through, and he wins battles that David needs to be won. But how do we judge him when he actually went against what the king, David, had said he was to do? So he's a bit of a mixed, you know, goody baddie, isn't he, really? Yeah. And we see then, don't we, how then it was actually Joab who finished Absalom off. Well, maybe he didn't actually quite finish him off. He was the one who put these javelins into Absalom, and it says that 10 of Joab's armor bearers actually struck him and killed him. So
I've got to ask, where was Absalom's troops in all this then? They'd either died or fled. Nobody was coming to his rescue.
Well, I imagine that when Absalom was going along, he was on his horse, on his mule. He was actually part of the band of people, so they were all charging through this forest. And suddenly, Absalom got caught by his hair and wasn't there. And maybe the horse and all the rest of them just sort of went travelling on.
Just travelling
oh my
on.
God, where's Absalom? You know, it is, well, obviously it's tragic, but you have to see it is slightly a comical thing. And I think, you know, if you do a Google search, there are paintings that have been done of it. I mean, it is, yeah, very, very striking. But, you know, with all of this, you have to see, don't you, that even though David has been deposed as king, and that might be seem to be a very bad time for him, God is working things out. Absalom does not have any trust in God. He seems to do things in his own strength. He's proud of himself, and he goes off and thinks he can be king, but he can't. He can't do things without God's help. And in all of this, God is helping David, you know, to get his position as king back. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go on. We're up to just verses 16 to 18. Leslie, did you offer before?
Yeah.
16 to 18, thanks.
Yes, yeah. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the King's Valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day.
Okay. So Joab sounds the trumpet, and that's the end of the battle. There was no point in pursuing it. Absalom now was dead. And yeah, he was thrown into a heap, into a pit, which would actually have been quite an ignominious burial for anybody. Remember, he was the king's son, but he was just chucked into a pit as a nobody. Then you have this contrast of how during his lifetime, Absalom had put up a monument to himself, you know, the great I am. So there's a real contrast, isn't there? Absalom thought he was wonderful, pushed himself forward and built monuments, but actually the reality is here that he was killed and just thrown into a pit. And the Israelites just sort of fled. Now they'd lost their leader. Okay, so we read on a bit more. We've got, I think we're going to read the whole of the next section, but I think maybe two people would be better if two people could read it. So first off, if someone can read 19 to 24. I can't quite see all of it. Is anyone volunteering?
Oh, I will if you like. I know I've done it once, but I don't mind reading again.
Marina's volunteer.
Verena has, yeah. So Verena, if you could read verses 19 to 24.
Yes.
And then Julie, if you could read 25 to 33, that would be great.
David mourns, it's called. Now, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. You are not the one to take the news today, Joab told him. You may take the news another time. but you must not do so today, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to a Cushite, go, tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite. But Joab replied, my son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward. He said, come what may, I want to run. So Joab said, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone.
The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, if he is alone, he must have good news. And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner, and he called down to the gatekeeper, look, another man running alone. The king said, he must be bringing good news too. The watchman said, it seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. He's a good man, the king said. He comes with good news. Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, all is well. He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king. The king asked, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, I saw great confusion just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was. The king said, stand aside and wait here. So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son.
Okay, thank you. So let's see if we can unpick and understand a little bit about what's happening here. We know Absalom's dead, and we know that they've got to get the news back to David, because David was back in the city of Mahanaim, some way away. And it sounds like he was, remember cities in those days had two walls, didn't they? The inner and outer, and with the great gateway in it. And David was sitting in between the walls rather than up on top, which is where the, what do you call the man who sits up there? The watchman was up there. Yeah. So Ahimaaz offers to go tell the king that that they've got a victory. Basically, they've been delivered from their enemies. Okay, but Joab probably knows that David's not going to be as pleased with this news as perhaps he should be, because he knows what's happened to Absalom. So Joab says to Ahimaaz, who is the priest's son, "You're not going to take the news. You can do another time, but not today, because the king's son is dead." And he didn't think in the past, when David's had bad news, he can sometimes get a bit, the bearer of bad news might not have been treated very well. So I think Joab foresees that and decides not to let Ahimaaz go. Instead, he asks the Cushite, who was a foreigner, remember, he was to go and tell the king what had happened. However, in verse 22, we see Ahimaaz is still, "Come what may, please let me run behind this. I want to go, I want to go." And Joab replies, "Why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab rather reluctantly lets him go. I suppose he thinks he's set off after the Cushite, so he won't get there first anyway. But it appears that the two men ran slightly different routes. And it was actually Ahimaaz who got to David first. And in verse 24 there, we see what happened. So what do you think in verses 24? What is David actually waiting for?
Good news.
Yeah, I think so. He's waiting there to hear what happens. What is he also, I think, what is he frightened about or fearing, perhaps?
Thought it was going to be bad news.
Yeah, he feared that it might be bad news, didn't he? So
Yes.
we have, go on, who's that?
Yes, if he was alone, it would be good news, but then he saw another runner. So obviously
Yeah.
it must be bad news.
No.
David's sitting there waiting and hearing what the watchman is saying. Well, there's one man coming, now there's another one, and he's kind of like, although in his heart he's full of dread that something bad might happen, he's thinking, oh, I think it's going to be good news, I think it's going to be good news. So we get this sort of perhaps rather comical again sort of thing, he runs like that, he must come with good news, da-di-da-di-da. And of course Ahimaaz gets there first, and I've got good news for you, Mr. King. All is well. But straight away the king asks, is the young man Absalom safe? That's down to verse 29. Now Ahimaaz rather he knows that Absalom is dead, but does he say that? No, he doesn't. He kind of fudges it a bit, doesn't he? He's sort of, oh, well, there was a lot of confusion I didn't actually see, but anyway, King David, you have got the victory. And then, of course, he's asked us to stand aside, wait while the Cushite arrives, and says, verse 31, my king, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you. Good news, David, good news. But the king says to him, is the young man Absalom safe? And the Cushite says, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. In other words, may all your enemies die. And yes, Absalom has died. So, yeah, one thing here. So the good news that David had been waiting for, really, that the uprising is quashed, has come. But we look at David's reaction there when he hears that Absalom has been killed. How do we, perhaps there's two words I think I can think of to actually describe David's reaction here and what might be causing it. What do you think?
He was grief-stricken.
He was grief-stricken. Obviously his son had died. Is there anything else that we might want to put into that?
I wonder if like now there was no opportunity for him to reconcile with his son as well, and that's been taken away from him. He can't, there's no reconciliation, there's no possibility now.
No, thanks for that, Carol. That's a good thought, isn't it?
I wonder also whether David realises in his heart of hearts that he never disciplined his sons, and whether there's some regret there.
Yeah, was there some guilt coming in here that maybe he hadn't, as you say, as Joyce says, hadn't brought his sons up and disciplined them and taught them the ways of the Lord, as perhaps he could have done. If you remember when we were in 2 Samuel chapter 12, after the incident of David and Bathsheba, when the prophet Nathan came to him, at the end there was a prophecy. In verse 10 it said, now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. So David at that point knew that he had sinned not only against Uriah and Bathsheba, but against God. And he knew that the punishment on him was, if you like, was ongoing, and the sword would never depart from his house. So now he hears that his son has been killed. I think also he recognises that he feels guilty because this was some of his own doing, because of his own sin earlier on. This has happened to him. So in a sense, I can't say he's to blame for Absalom's death, but it was kind of an outcoming of his own sin earlier on, an outworking of it maybe. So David feels deep, deep sorrow, but perhaps that is mingled with guilt. Okay, so the narrative actually goes on into chapter 19 now. So we're just going to read the first 8 verses. Volunteer? Thanks, Zoe. Thank you.
Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, "The king is grieving for his son." The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, "Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now." So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, "The king is sitting in the gateway," they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes.
Okay, so there's been a great victory for those loyal to David. Verse 3, we hear how the men stole into the city as men stealing who are ashamed when they flee from battle. So what's going on there?
Well, they know that David is mourning for the death of his son, so they don't feel that they can celebrate this victory as I guess they normally would when they've defeated another army.
It must be quite confusing for them, isn't it? They've been sent out on this battle and they're victorious, and suddenly, oh, have we done the right thing? What's happened? It's just confusion. They're sort of slinking back into the city as if they'd been defeated, because David is in this state of mourning. So very confusing for the troops there. And now Joab really comes into his own, verses 5 to 7 there. How would you describe what Joab says to David?
Get your act together.
Get your act together. Yeah. I put down here, he gives the king a right rollicking, if that's still an expression that we understand. Yeah, I mean, he's saying to Joab, isn't he? Look, these men have, fought for you. They've given their lives for you. And now, you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. It's as if these men who fought for you mean nothing to you. And actually, if Absalom had come back alive and all the men were dead, you'd be happy. No, David, that's not acceptable. You're the king. That is not at all how things should be. So we're left to muse, aren't we, whether Joab was right to tell the king off, but he was the king's leader of his army, and perhaps he was actually giving wise insight for David, when David seems to be so distracted by what was going on in his own personal life. So maybe he just wasn't thinking right. And help us out.
I was just thinking, I don't know whether it's a parallel, but I was thinking of people like our own Queen, who often has to kind of we expect her to bury her own grief in order to sort of be Queen. I think it's a hard ask, because David is acting as a father, isn't he? But because of his position, he's got to act in a different way, so he can't kind of go through that grief process as most people would be allowed to do. I don't know.
No, that's true, isn't it? Yeah. So in verse 8, what is David's response to Joab's telling off?
He responded positively.
What did he do?
He got up and greeted the men.
Yes. Where did he go, actually? To signify the gateway, which the well, what was the significance of David sitting in the gateway then?
The public.
I suppose it shows he was in control and he'd got something to say. That was his pace of the beginning of his kingdom. I mean, that's where he'd been sitting, where he was waiting for all the news to come through, wasn't it? In the gateway. It was obviously a very, very important place.
Yeah. I think before he'd been hiding a bit down below, I think up in the gateway, I think he was actually up so that the people could see him. He was visible, and they knew that David was taking his place as king again, and they could see that from round about. David's back where he should be. He's the king. It wasn't in Jerusalem at this point. They're still in Mahanaim, but nevertheless, David was king over his troops there.
Isn't it also showing he's kind of available to them?
Yes, that's right, because I think and other times we see how people came up to the king to give them their grievances, to share things and to get wisdom or to get advice. So David is back acknowledging that he is the king, that he is in control of this lot, and we'll come back next week and we'll see what happens from there. This is a final thing.
Again, that reminds me of Queen Victoria. Prince Albert died, and she hid herself away from the people for years, and her government and her councillors were all urging her to come back out into public again. The people wanted to see her, so it just reminded me of that.
Okay, I didn't know that. So that, all of those things. It is a very human, if you like, isn't it? And we can perhaps see that today.
I was thinking also, that's where Absalom sat, wasn't he? And got all people on his side. He was at the gateway, wasn't he, for a number of years to try and win people's hearts. So obviously it was a significant place to be safe.
Remember, he was at the gateway down in Judah, wasn't he? I can't remember. Was he in Bethlehem? I don't know. Where anyway, he was where he gathered all the people of Judah to him. I think I'm right. Might have remembered it wrongly, but anyway, he was in a different place, I think. But it's the same significance of the gateway and of the city. Yeah. So what happened to all the defeated Israelites?
Went home. They fled.
They fled, didn't they? They all went home. Their dreams were shattered. They hadn't come. They'd taken sides with Absalom, and now they were just running away because they were probably quite scared, actually. Now their self-appointed king is gone, and they're just, oh my goodness, now what? So I say I have to come back next week for, the story continues. But I think on a sort of what does this story mean for us? I was thinking about this earlier, because what I think is that because we know the whole story, perhaps we don't always dwell enough on the in-between bits, because here was David, he'd become king and everything was fine, and suddenly he's out in the the wilderness, he's got no food and he's on the run again. And at that point, he must have felt pretty low. We've looked at some of the Psalms, haven't we, where he's actually said, gosh, this isn't working out as it should do, but Lord, I trust you. And how much us in our lives that sometimes things are happening and we may be in the moment of thinking, well, this doesn't make sense, Lord, what on earth is happening here? And perhaps the encouragement is for us is to trust God that he will work things out. We can't see the future. We don't know how things are going to change, but we just have to walk step by step, don't we, and day by day with God. And even if it's a pretty tough place that we might be in at any one moment in our lives, that God is still there, as he was with David, even in the roughest and blackest of moments, really. So I hope that can give us some encouragement as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Sue, for that this morning. Yeah, that's it's been a good study. I'm just going to stop the recording.